President Roosevelt tried to avoid all of Wilson's mistakes. American policy substantially favored Britain and its allies. Unlike the loans in World War I, the United States made large-scale grants of military and economic aid to the Allies through Lend-Lease. Industries greatly expanded to produce war materials. The United States officially entered World War II against Germany, Japan, and Italy in December 1941, following the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. This time, the U.S. was a full-fledged member of the Allies, and not just an associate, as in the First War. During the war, the United States conducted military operations on both the Atlantic and Pacific fronts. The United States found itself in a uniquely powerful position due to lack of damage to its domestic industries. It found itself in direct competition with a growing power, the Soviet Union. In the aftermath of the European campaign, the United States enacted the Marshall Plan, which supplied its European allies with $13 billion in reconstruction aid. June 1945, the United Nations was formed in response to World War II and the fact that the League of Nations had failed. Members of the League realized that the idea of a collaborative organization would work, but things needed to be changed so that the organization would be more fair. The United States and the Soviet Union, as well as Britain, France, and China, became permanent members of the Security Council with veto power. The idea of the UN was to promote world peace through consensus among nations. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave a speech on March 5, 1946, at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. He named his speech "The Sinews of Peace" and called for alliance against the spread of Soviet communism. The Truman Doctrine was a policy set forth by Harry Truman, the U.S. President, in a speech on March 12, 1947, stating that the U.S. would support Greece and Turkey with economic and military aid to prevent their falling into the Soviet sphere. September 18, 1947, United States military planners had always relied on intelligence during wartime, but it was not until World War II that the United States government began collecting intelligence systematically. Because President Roosevelt had doubts about the United States' effectiveness of the nation's intelligence gathering, they formed the CIA. April 1948, the Marshall Plan was a program of economic aid to European countries to help them rebuild after World War II. In June 1948, cargo planes delivered all food, fuel, and other essential goods to the people living in West Berlin during an 11-month period of the Cold War. The U.S. established a containment policy.
There are always changes in technology throughout time. These inventions can either be used for recreational use or as a means to get work done. The color TV. Color television had its beginnings in the late 1940s alongside black and white television. CBS began experimental color field tests using film as early as August 28, 1940, and live cameras by November 12. NBC made its first field test of color television on February 20, 1941. CBS began daily color field tests on June 1, 1941. The blood bank. In 1940, U.S. had processed and tested plasma to be sent to Great Britain. In 1941, the Red Cross then agrees to organize a civilian blood donor service to collect blood plasma for the war effort. 1947, the community blood banks joined together to form a national network of blood banks called the American Association of Blood Banks. In 1942, penicillin had been introduced. This had begun the era of antibiotics. It was recognized as one of the greatest advances in therapeutic medicine. The discovery of penicillin and the initial recognition of its therapeutic potential occurred in the United Kingdom. But due to World War II, the United States played the major role in developing large-scale production of the drug, thus making a life-saving substance in limited supply into a widely available medicine. Before it had been discovered, there were no treatments for infections such as pneumonia, gonorrhea, or rheumatic fever. In 1940, Florey carried out vital experiments, showing that penicillin could protect mice against infection from deadly streptococcus. Then on February 12, 1941, a 43-year-old policeman, Albert Alexander, became the first recipient of the Oxford penicillin. The electronic digital computer. In 1942, John V. Atanasov had finished building the first electronic digital computer with the assistance of German engineer Konrad Zuse and graduate student Clifford E. Berry. In 1944, Howard Aiken and a group of engineers at International Business Machines Corporation completed work on the Harvard Mark I, a machine whose data processing operations were controlled primarily by electronic relays, or switching devices. Nuclear recreation. In 1941, March 20th, American physicists confirmed that plutonium is fissionable, thus usable for a bomb. Soon, President Roosevelt authorizes the Manhattan Engineering District, the secret U.S. project to build an atomic bomb, later to be called the Manhattan Project, is put under the direction of the Office of Scientific Research and Development. 1942, Brigadier General Leslie Groves is put in charge of the Manhattan Project. In 1943, January, planning begins for construction of reactors at Hanford, Washington, to breed plutonium for a bomb. But then in 1945, July 16th, U.S. explodes the world's first atomic bomb, the Trinity test, at Alamogordo, New Mexico. August 6th, Little Boy, a uranium bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Japan, killing between 80,000 to 140,000 people. Then 3 days later, August 9th, Fat Man, another plutonium bomb, was dropped on Nagasaki, Japan, killed about 74,000.
Although the 1940s was a decade dominated by World War II, important and noteworthy films about a wide variety of subjects were made during that era. Hollywood was instrumental in producing dozens of classic films during the 1940s, several of which were about the war and some are on most lists of all-time great films. European cinema survived, although obviously curdled during the wartime, and yet many films of high quality were made in the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and the Soviet Union, and elsewhere in Europe. The cinema of Japan also survived. Akira Kurosawa and other directors managed to produce significant films during the 1940s. Film noir, a film style that incorporated crime dramas with dark images, became largely prevalent during the decade. Films such as The Maltese Falcon and The Big Sleep are considered classics and helped launch the careers of legendary actors such as Humphrey Bogart and Ava Gardner. The genre had been widely copied since its initial inception. The most popular music style during the 1940s was swing, which prevailed during the World War II and the late periods of 1940s. Les swing was prominent in crooners like Frank Sinatra, along with genres such as bebop, and the early traces of rock and roll were prevalent. These are the main poems and articles during the 1940s. For Whom the Bell Tolls, Ernest Hemingway in 1940, The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus in 1942, The Stranger by Albert Camus in 1942, The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry in 1943, Anti-Semite and Jew by Jean-Paul Sartre in 1943, The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand in 1943, No Exit by Jean-Paul in 1944, Pippi Longstocking by Astrid Lindgren in 1945, The Diary of Anne Frank by Anne Frank in 1947, The Death of a Salesman by Arthur Miller in 1949, 1984 by George Orwell in 1949, and The Glass Menagerie by Tennessee Williams in 1944. Even with the challenges imposed by shortages in rayon, nylon, wool, leather, rubber, metal, and even the amount of fabric that could be produced in any one garment, the fashion industry's wheels kept chugging slowly along, producing what it could. After the fall of France in 1940, Hollywood drove fashion in the United States almost entirely, with the exception of a few trends coming from war-torn London in 1944 and 1945. As America's own rationing hit full force and the idea of function seemed to overtake fashion, if only for a few short months until the end of the war, fabrics shifted dramatically as rationing and wartime shortages controlled important items such as silks and furs. Floral prints seemed to dominate the early 1940s, with the mid to late 1940s also seeing what is sometimes referred to as atomic prints or geometric patterns and shapes. The color of fashion seemed to even go to the war, with patriotic nautical themes and dark green khakis dominating the color palettes as trousers and wedges shortly and slowly replaced dresses and more traditionally heels due to shortages in stockings and gasoline.
Its allies and collaborators. Some scholars maintain that the definition of the Holocaust should also include the Nazis' systematic murdering of millions of peoples of other ethnic groups, such as Poles or Polish people, the Romanians, the Soviet citizens, the gays. By this definition, the total number of Holocaust victims is between 11 and 17 million people. The German instrument of surrender signed May 7th and May 8th of 1945 caused the end of the war and victory in Europe Day. Atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki August 6th and August 9th of 1945 caused Japan to surrender on August 15th of that year. World War II officially ends on September 2nd, 1945. In 1948, Arab-Israeli War, which ended in 1949, was the war fought between nearly declared State of Israel and its Arab neighbors. The war commenced upon termination of British mandate of Palestine in mid-May of 1948. The Arab rejection of 1947 United Nations partition plan for Palestine would have created an Arab state and a Jewish state by side. Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria attacked the state of Israel. In its conclusion, Israel managed to defeat the Arab armies. Establishment of the Defiance Alliance caused NATO on April 4th, 1949. And that is all.